Thank you. Police emergency. What's your location?
Good morning, Brookfield.
And what's happening there?
I don't want to be alarmist. I tried the 131 number, but just went on forever.
Yep.
My wife isn't home.
What's your name, first of all?
I'm sorry. Gerard.
And what's your wife's name?
Alison with 2 L's.
I'm Amelia Saw, and this is Twisted Minds, a podcast about what makes criminals tick and the people who dedicate their lives to finding out.
Most of my work surrounds manner of death determinations and trying to figure out if a death is going to be an accident or a suicide or a homicide, and what bad guys do, I guess, to try to make homicides look like something else, or to make a homicide that's a domestic violence homicide look like a burglary or something like that.
Not all murders are straightforward. The most cunning killers cover their tracks. They might make the death look like a suicide or a terrible accident. That's where Dr. Claire Ferguson comes in. She's a trained psychologist and criminologist who specialises in spotting the red flags of disguised homicide. It's not every little girl's dream, but death and crime have always been part of Claire's life.
The joke that we use in my family is that criminology and weird behaviors, I guess, offending behaviors, is the family business. So my mom and my older sister both work with offenders and always have. And so that was sort of the dinner table conversation around the Ferguson household when I was a kid. And that's kind of, I guess it was normalized. So that's how I got interested in this space. I actually wanted to be, I think, a forensic psych, and I did some stuff with offenders after my undergraduate degree. And then I did my honors, and my lovely honors supervisor said to me, "You realize that you're a lot more interested in criminology and forensic science than you are the mental health side of things."
These days, Claire lives on the Gold Coast with her family and works with the Queensland Police and the Queensland University of Technology. But she grew up in Canada.
My mom she's retired now, but she was a director of the parole board in Canada, and then she was on the parole board. So stories about offenders were kind of told. And my sister she now works in a halfway house with high risk offenders, which is like where people go when they're on parole but not in the community yet. So she has plenty of stories. But before that, she was in child protection for a long time and working with high risk young offenders and things like that in between.
You guys must be the most interesting family to have Christmas dinner with.
Oh, bring your dark sense of humor. Just don't show up if you can't stand death jokes. Yeah. And my poor dad, is just like, what is going on? He did finance stuff before he retired. So he's just like, guys, enough.
So how does a suspicious death file end up on Claire's desk?
Often the case has been originally investigated as non-criminal or non-suspicious. And then later, either more information came to light that makes it look suspicious, or maybe the coroner has said, I'm not happy to rule this an accidental death or a suicide, and more investigation needs to be done.
The coroner is a senior judicial officer who deals in death. When someone dies violently, unexpectedly, or suddenly, the coroner is notified. It's their job to make a ruling on the cause of death and whether there are any circumstances that need to be looked into.
So normally when I get a case, it's been kind of bounced around a bit. And often I will tell policing agencies, I need every single thing that you have in terms of evidence and the whole story. And there sometimes isn't a lot, which speaks to the difficulty of investigating these cases after they've been buttoned up as or misclassified, I guess, in the first instance, or potentially misclassified. I sometimes get cases across my desk or in my research where, they took 6 photos and somebody took them on their police mobile phone. And then it became clear later on that, in fact, it wasn't such an obvious suicide. And, if it had been ruled a homicide, they probably would have taken 600 photos and collected tons of different pieces of evidence, and it's just gone. And there's no really coming back from that. And it can really be detrimental to prosecutions. And I think, just stress-wise as well, you can imagine how hard it is for the family.
Good evening. The husband of a woman who mysteriously disappeared from her Kenmore home last Thursday night has broken his silence to 9 News.
The hunt for Alison Baden-Clay has intensified, with police now searching industrial garbage bins for evidence.
Another day of searching has found no trace of the Brookfield mother of 3.
Gerard Baden-Clay this morning briefly visited the home he shared with wife Alison. He collected toys and clothes for his 3 daughters before returning to his parents' house. How's everything going, Gerard?
Police have confirmed that the body recovered in Western Brisbane yesterday is that of missing mother Alison Baden-Clay. Her husband issued a statement this evening saying he's devastated by his wife's death.
The murder of Alison Baden-Clay made headlines across Australia. In April 2012, Gerard killed the mother of 3, dumping her body under a bridge 13 kilometres from their Brisbane home. He had the motive. He was having a long-term affair with a colleague, and Alison had a sizable life insurance policy. It would have gone a long way to get his struggling real estate business out of the red. And Gerard was convinced he'd never get caught.
And we now take you to breaking news, and the convicted killer Gerard Baden-Clay faces life behind bars after the High Court upheld the appeal and reinstated his conviction for the 2010 murder of his wife Alison in Brisbane.
Baden-Clay is such an interesting one because he had kind of a double-barreled approach to detection avoidance, which a lot of offenders do.
So if we talk about detection avoidance, which if I explain that in really simple terms to our listeners, that's just things people do to stop themselves getting caught, right?
Yep. So the first barrel of the double barrel was plan A kind of was they won't suspect that I've done something. And so there was some sophistication in the attempted manipulation of police.
Thank you. Police emergency. What's your location?
Good morning, Brookfield.
Whereabouts in Brookfield, sir?
593 Brookfield Road, Brookfield.
And what's happening there?
I don't want to be alarmist. I tried the 131 number, but just went on forever.
Yep.
My wife isn't home. I don't know where she is.
Okay. When did you last see her, sir?
So what he did to try to avoid detection was first calling in the missing persons report. So she was missing for an hour before he actually called police, which is not very long as far as missing persons go. I mean, the context of that was that she was missing in the morning when she would usually be getting kids ready for school. So that might speed things up a little bit in terms of calling the police, but it was still very, very quick. Most people would not report a missing person for a much more significant period of time. I think especially if you're talking about what we now know was happening, which was the relationship was not that great, and there had been some conflict the night before. So most husbands would probably just assume, oh, she's angry and she's gone to prove a point. I have to get the kids ready for school. No worries. But he called the police to report her missing.
When did you last see her, sir?
Last night when we went to bed, when I went to bed, and I got up this morning and she wasn't there, and that's not unusual. She often goes for a walk in the morning.
Yep.
I've texted her and called her a number of times. I think she has her phone with her.
Yep. All right. And what's your wife?
I'm now driving the streets. My father's come over and to look after my children.
Yeah. Okay. So what's your name?
The other thing that he did for the first barrel of the double-barrel detection avoidance was sending Alison the text messages to prove that he was looking for her. So this is actually pretty sophisticated from an offender's standpoint. A lot of offenders will forget to do this. So he was texting her in the morning when she was supposedly missing, saying, "Good morning, how did you sleep? Where are you? You know, this is what's happening with our kids. Love, Jared." And then he sent another one saying that he was concerned about her. "The kids are up. I'm getting them ready for school, blah, blah, blah." So doing the like good dad / concerned husband routine was all part of the detection avoidance. And you can see that really manipulative behavior in there. Like, he's not just highlighting that she's gone and she's supposed to be getting kids ready for school. He's also setting himself up as Mr. Perfect, right? I've got the kids all ready. I'm making their lunches, blah, blah, blah.
What I'll do, I'll go and put a broadcast on for the police to keep a lookout for your wife. Are you going to go back home? Because we'll get police to come and see you.
I need to go home and get the kids ready for school.
Yeah. All right, Jared. I'll get police to come and see you, okay? What's the best contact number for you? Yep.
496.
Yep.
100.
Okay, just give us a call back if she hasn't returned before police get there, okay? All right, thanks, Jared. Bye-bye.
So lucky for us, the Queensland Police investigators that first showed up, which were, I think, fairly junior investigators, were onto this straight away. So his idea that no one's ever going to suspect me failed immediately. As soon as they got to the house, he did not pass the smell test, which was like so awesome from an investigative standpoint. They just knew this is crap, and start investigating as if he's done something wrong.
Do you think it was just a gut feeling they had?
I think it was the gut feeling. I also think it was the scratches on his face.
When police arrived at Alison and Gerard Baden-Clay's house following his missing persons report, the officers noticed Gerard had 2 distinct injuries on his cheek. Gerard's explanation was that he had cut himself shaving, but the wounds looked more like scratches. They immediately set detectives on alert. Here's Senior Sergeant Narelle Curtis.
Gerard, I have to ask this question. Those 2 marks on your face could be consistent with having been scratched.
Yes, I was asked that this morning. No, it's not. I cut myself shaving.
I think if it hadn't been for the scratches, there might have been less suspicion, but yeah, they were a dead giveaway. And so lucky that those investigators had been well trained to think about following their instincts, because they have to think about triage. So, you know, there's not endless budget for every single thing. And if they want to investigate a bit more, they have to be able to verbalize why that is. And sometimes it's just a feeling. And they were able to think really critically and clearly and be able to make that argument that something more needs to happen here.
The scratches on Gerard's face became a pivotal part of the legal case against him. His lie literally haunted him through his trial and appeal, all the way to his final battle in the High Court.
One of the things that I kind of loved about that is that, in fact, razor injuries or shaver injuries are one of the most researched injury wound patterns that we know about. Why? Because razor companies get sued. So he didn't think that there would be this body of literature about what a shaver injury actually looks like. And it is not like the injury that he had. So there was a real lack of sophistication there.
So right from the beginning, cracks was starting to show in Baden-Clay's first deception strategy. Remember, his first strategy was that no one would ever suspect him of hurting Alison. But he was going to stick to his guns. So much so that when a reporter confronted him on his doorstep 5 days after Alison went missing, he gave this class act performance.
I'm trying to look after my children at the moment. I've got 3 young girls, and we really trust that the police are doing everything they can to find my wife, and we just hope that she'll come home soon.
Oscar-winning performances aside, Baden-Clay had also thought of a backup plan, just in case his plan A fell through.
The second barrel was, if they suspect me, they'll never be able to prove it was me.
And he thought the best way to cover his link to the crime would be to dump her body far away from the family home.
The detection avoidance that went towards that was transporting the body. So that allowed him to then make this missing persons claim, and it just provides, of course, physical distance. So he could have tried to stage it as like a legitimate, a non-suspicious death that happened at the house. But transportation of the body gave him a window of time in order to create that narrative, establish the narrative, and also in the hopes that physical evidence might degrade in that time and injuries would be obfuscated and things like that, which absolutely happened. Allows him time to clean up and think about some of the kind of unknown factors that he might not have planned for. It also allows him time to clean up vehicles. If there was a primary crime scene in the home, he would have had time to tidy that up. Or if there was weapons, he might have been able to get rid of weapons. We don't know. And transporting the body to allow for that missing persons report also could have allowed him to, I guess, have that extra time period in the morning to try to establish that innocent scenario, the good dad persona thing. So he could show the police, here's my phone, look, these are the messages I sent her, and she hasn't been responding. But what that also did, in terms of, it allows for detection avoidance, but it also showed his criminal inexperience. So when he started to be suspected, remember his idea of the second barrel was, if they do suspect me, they won't be able to prove it. Then there were a few other things that he didn't sort of account for. So the first one was the potential for additional witnesses when you transport the body, like seeing the cars. And what he ended up getting convicted on, not just, but in combination with other things, was the plant evidence. So it created these 2 sets of plant evidence that they were able to establish couldn't have come from anywhere besides their home and the place where the body was found.
Forensic scientists were able to find 6 different species of plants in Alison's hair and jumper. These same 6 species grew around the Baden-Clay's family home, around the back patio, carport and driveway. But only 2 of the species of plants grew at Colo Creek, where Alison's body was found. Prosecutors said that was proof Alison was killed at home and her body dragged through the property. There was also a blood stain found in the boot of Baden-Clay's car, which matched Alison's DNA. But why would a husband want to do this to the mother of his 3 children? It was clear Alison had lived in an abusive relationship, but what made Baden-Clay escalate the abuse to murder?
Well, I don't know him, and I don't know the ins and outs of the relationship, but I do know that in a lot of these cases, homicide, and this sounds horrible, but in a lot of these cases, homicide is easier. It's the better alternative to divorce. Because if you think about someone that's highly egotistical, they don't want to be divorced. They don't want to lose more of their money to this woman that they don't think deserves it. And so homicide creates this special circumstance where they actually get to frame how they look in terms of being sympathetic, I guess. If you tell people I'm a widower and my wife was murdered, or my wife committed suicide or died in an accident or whatever, that is more interesting and maybe looks better to someone with that personality type than saying you're divorced. He gets to keep all of the money. He gets to control what happens with the kids, and he gets to blame her for all of the crap that happened in their whole relationship. So it becomes an attractive option for somebody that's that controlling and self-absorbed. So I think for him, it was probably a no-brainer. I don't know if in the circumstance he lost his temper and then he staged the crime scene, after the fact, or if he thought about that all along. I don't think we'll ever be able to say, but certainly he did a lot of things for it to have been a spur of the moment decision to try to stage the crime scene as a missing person.
Gerard Baden-Clay is currently serving a minimum of 15 years for the murder of his wife Alison. It is understood he is currently at Brisbane's Walston Correctional Centre, a protection prison, and is reportedly a model prisoner. But Claire believes Baden-Clay belongs to a special group of particularly cruel domestic violence killers who keep controlling and abusing their victims even after they're dead.
I think that detection avoidance for a normal offender is just about detection avoidance. It's about not going to prison. So, wear a condom, wear gloves, don't let witnesses see you, blah, blah, blah. It's fairly straightforward. But in an intimate partner femicide or an intimate partner homicide, but usually a femicide, the detection avoidance is actually part of the control and part of the motivation for wanting to perpetrate the homicide. So it then becomes, you're punishing the victim, and you're also able to control the money, the kids, how the victim is portrayed in death. And so, offenders will often totally malign the victim after they die and try to do it in such a way that looks like they're just stating the facts. Like, she fell off of the building and she was just so clumsy and she was drunk or she was taking pills or what have you. And that's what caused her to fall. And now, lo and behold, I have control over the kids, all of her money, and so on and so forth. And they like that because it means they don't have to share, right? So even though she's dead, so they don't have to share with her, which is attractive in terms of many offenders. So they've punished her adequately and gotten their revenge on her. But they can also then continue their revenge on her family. They don't have to allow children to see the maternal grandparents. They get life insurance money, and the maternal family doesn't get that, or the kids don't get that, and so on and so forth.
So from a psychological perspective, it's like they're using murder as a way to kind of, they're getting a kick out of still being able to control this person even after they're dead. They're getting a bit of a high from that. Yeah,
I don't know if you would conceptualize it as a feeling of a high. I'm sure it's different for everybody, but I think it's like almost righteous indignation. Like, I showed you, now all of this is mine and none of it is yours, and you're dead. And I told you that if you didn't do what I said, you would end up here, and now you are. So, ha. And, it's so interesting because in intimate partner femicides, we sometimes see offenders saying that exact thing. They will try to recruit police to kind of be on their side about it. Like, oh, well, she was so terrible. She did this and that, and she nagged me all the time, and she stressed me out, and she drank too much, and she wouldn't have sex when I wanted her to, and blah, blah, blah. And they think that people are going to be on their side about it. And sometimes they can be very manipulative and very convincing that she was so terrible.
In relationships where there's coercive control, does that necessarily mean that offenders often plan those murders as part of the control?
I don't know that they necessarily plan the specifics, but what we do know is that in cases with coercive control that end in homicide, they often talk about the homicide before they do it. So they mightn't say, I am going to, shoot you in the head and then tell people that you committed suicide. But they'll say, maybe even for years beforehand, I'll make it look like a suicide. For example, I researched one case, this was not in Australia, where the offender would continuously tell the victim, he was coercively controlling, he would continuously tell her, I'll make you disappear. And then what he did was tell everyone that she left him and went on vacation and that she'd run away with some other man and just left their 3 children. And he put her body through a wood chipper to literally make her body disappear.
So what are the red flags that you need to look for in an offender's behaviour that might kind of indicate that perhaps everything's not as it seems, perhaps it is not a suicide or a missing persons?
Well, it really depends on what the story is that the person is telling you. So if you have a staged homicide or a concealed homicide, generally speaking, the person that's reporting that will be a person of interest. And that's, I guess, true of any type of suspicious death. So depending on what sort of the narrative is of the death will dictate what the red flags are. So for example, if you have the story is, husband arrived home and the house has been burglarized and the wife has been killed, then the red flags might be things like no obvious point of entry or points of entry for a stranger offender that don't make sense, like entering the house on the second story at the front, where we know that if someone was actually going to burglarize a house, they would probably go to the back because they're less likely to be seen, and they wouldn't bother usually going to a second story window if they could just as easily get in a first story window. Things like ransacking of the crime scene but without valuables missing, or valuables allegedly missing that can't be verified, like large sums of cash that you can't actually say were ever in the house in the first place. It's just somebody saying that was there. Things like the person that's not posing the biggest threat to offenders is victimized. Is not victimized. So let's say you have a big beefy man and a woman, an offender is probably going to want to defend themselves against the person posing the greater physical threat than they would the woman. So if the guy has no injuries and the woman is killed, that might raise a red flag. But it really is a matter of thinking about the details of the narrative that the police are given, and also making sure that the narrative is consistent. So when I do training for police, I always tell them to make sure that they talk to people about what the narrative has been to others. So what did this person say happened to the ambulance officers? What did they say happened to their mother or the mother of the victim or whatever? You have to actually look for that type of information. Don't just think about whether the narrative given to you makes sense, but whether it's consistent across people.
The double homicide of best friends Vicky Arnold and Julianne Leigh is one of Queensland's most enduring mysteries. It's also a case with a million red flags. But when the 2 women were discovered with gunshot wounds in a 4-wheel drive in the North Queensland bush, police quickly decided Vicky had killed Julianne and then taken her own life.
Friends Vicky Arnold and Julianne Leigh were killed 20 years ago. But who did it?
Lead investigator Michael Hayes had no experience with homicide. He failed to deal with the crime scene correctly and should have called in experts from Brisbane. Vicky's hands were never tested for gunshot residue and there were no fingerprints found in the car or on the bullets.
The coroner has rejected murder-suicide in the case of best friends Julianne Leigh and Vicky Arnold, whose body bodies were found near Atherton 22 years ago.
The coroner shocked just about everyone in the courtroom this afternoon when he ruled that Alan Lay should stand trial for the unlawful killing of his wife Julianne and her best friend Vicky, Arnold. He says their deaths were not murder-suicide. Mr Lay was the last person to see the two women alive in far north Queensland back in 1991, and the coroner feels there's a good chance that a properly instructed jury could find him guilty.
What were the red flags that this was definitely not as it seemed?
Well, firstly, I should say that, of course, there was a lot of mistakes made in this case, but the system, so it happened in 1991, and so the system for how deaths get investigated now has changed dramatically in Queensland. The investigators involved, I think, really felt quite horrible about how this case proceeded. So that's really important, because sometimes with law enforcement agencies, you might get people being like, no, we did everything right, and a stark refusal to really admit that anything went wrong. And that is absolutely not what happened here. So a lot has changed, which is great. There were some big red flags, and there were some things that might have been red flags, but we will never know because they weren't properly documented. So things like Vicky Arnold had the gun sawn-off rifle in her hand. Well, the position of that firearm relative to how she was sitting actually made no sense whatsoever. So that in and of itself could have been a red flag to investigators. She was kind of wedged into the floor well of the passenger seat of this car, and then she was twisted and had her arms on the seat and had the gun in her hand. So of course, it's a weird position. That it doesn't scream double homicide. It just says keep looking for information. That's what it should have said to investigators anyway. The other thing is she had 3 gunshot wounds, one under the chin, one to the temple, and one to the leg. So for a suicide, that's actually quite a lot. Again, it doesn't say this couldn't have been a suicide for her, but it does say we need to explain this and we need to maybe keep looking and not just button everything up as a murder-suicide and go home. The other thing that I think is most important is the complete lack of motive for her to have done this. So, no criminal history, no real issues. Why would she all of a sudden just decide to murder her best friend and commit suicide? There was very few risk factors of suicide on its own, let alone murder-suicide. So, all of these things that we kind of think of as the basics of what you look for in suicide, like a lack of future planning, some major stressful event, giving away possessions, things like that, very easy things to look for. None of that was there. And so it really made no sense at all. I think the reason why it ended up being attributed to her is just because she was holding the gun. So of course it couldn't have been Vicky Arnold that killed everyone. The investigators were a little bit, a disadvantage just because it took so long to find the bodies. There was a lot of decomposition. They didn't know, what physical evidence had been ruined and what hadn't been, etc. And also they were really worried about overtime because they'd been searching for these 2 women for quite a period of time and had spent a lot of money doing that.
A number of people were named as persons of interest as police reviewed the cold case on multiple occasions. The case also went to inquest 3 times. The final coroner to look at the case in 2013 ruled that Julianne's husband, Alan Lay, should stand trial for double murder, and a warrant was issued for his arrest.
I mean, the amount of expertise that has gone into this now is incredible. And the latest decision, official decision that's been made, was Alan Leahy to stand trial.
What were some of the reasons in your mind that might have made him a good suspect?
Oh, goodness. Well, his sexual relationship with the little sister being the major one. They had, even a little bit of digging would have showed that their financial situation was very tenuous. They had sold, I think they had sold the car that the women were actually found in, which was their only vehicle. And they had all of these kids, and she had this babysitting business that she needed a car for. So that kind of goes to show the extent of the financial stress that they were under. If you're selling your only real ability to make money. And they had a house that they were building that had all of these problems, and so on and so forth. So even just that might have been enough to go, oh, maybe we should look into this a bit more.
The other thing that when I was reading over the notes that I found quite interesting was just tiny little things that could have shown holes in Mr. Lay's story. He reported the women missing, and he said that he last saw them when they were going out for a fishing trip, and there was fishing gear found in the car, but it was missing things that they would have needed, like a torch. Mrs. Arnold didn't have glasses with her that she needed to see.
And where they went, there was no fishing where they went, where they were found. I guess if you could explain it as someone jumped in the car and forced them to drive out there. But yeah, you have to try to explain those little things. The other thing was they supposedly left at midnight or whatever, and she had a brand new baby. Who is going out? You're breastfeeding this new baby and you're like, oh, sure, let's go fishing at friggin' midnight. You have to be a keen fisherman. And I don't know if she was.
But Mr. Lay never ended up standing trial. He appealed the coroner's decision, and in 2015, the Department of Public Prosecutions dropped the case. Then, in 2018, Mr. Lay died. With so many years past, crucial evidence lost, and the death of one of the main suspects, many now fear the case will never be solved. If only they had a super sleuth like Claire around when Julianne and Vicky were first discovered. These poor women could have been buried with the truth on their side.
Next episode, we meet forensic psychiatrist Dr. Richard First. He's experienced firsthand what it's like to switch on the news and see that one of your patients has beheaded their own mother.